You are listening to WTUZ Radio Podcast. Welcome to WTUZ Radio Podcast. I am your host, Rhonda. And today's topic, this will be a tough one, family. Now, this is just my particular personal theory, just based on the research I've been doing and with the accumulation of other things. This is what I've come up as a conclusion of the block of time / history that has been covered up. Some say missing. So today's topic is going to be about the orphanage, the Indian orphanages, asylums, and re-educational centers were actually a part of a major reset for a couple of reasons. So with that said, let's get started. So we all know, well, most of us know, and if not, we'll get into that as well. You've heard things about the orphan trains. And when we typically hear about the orphan trains, we think about Caucasian children, these mass amount of children that were orphanage, and they were shipped and trained literally around the world. Okay. And the particular podcast that I did regarding the miseducation of the Indian really had me thinking, something's not right here. You have all of these little children being put in these boarding schools, and then on top of it, you have the orphan trains. Something's not right. Okay? Then you have to factor in they called them back in the day, the insane asylums. And then it clicked to me. You know what? This is much deeper than we think. This was really about reprogramming an entire generation with the applicable history that they wanted. This is how the switching of identities happened. So meaning they took the young children, which would be the future generations, and they educated them with a specific identity and a specific historical timeline. Okay? And in addition to that, the insane asylums were set up as literally prisoners for the adults that would not go along with the program. Okay? Now again, this is just a theory of mine, but I find it awfully strange that around the 1700s, the 1800s, and specifically 1800s, in the midst of a civil war, you have insane asylums popping up, all of these re-education centers for all children, whether Caucasian or melanated. Okay? And this was around the world, family. This happened in Europe as well as the Americas, but I'm only going to focus on the Americas. So let's get started. Okay, and shout out to the Mud Flood community for bringing up the Orphan Trains. That's where I first heard it. And linking in the insane asylums. That's not the first time I heard it. And but they reminded me. I literally had to go back. My memory was sparked just hearing the elders, and specifically one of my elders who has transitioned, a great aunt, speaking on the insane asylum, because back during that time, people could literally get their people committed to one of these insane asylums without much evidence at all. Specifically, husbands were locking up their wives. Okay? And they really had to do a lot to get themselves out of that situation. Okay? To get themselves out of that asylum. So she was now, I'm a real little bitty girl at this point. So it was meant for me to hear that conversation. She, of course, was not directly talking to me. I just so happened to be in another room hearing this conversation, which I needed to hear that conversation for these particular times. So she was describing the conditions in the asylum, and I was just horrified as a little girl. But that stuck with me, because all I kept thinking is, how could that be allowed to go on? And then number two, why would someone do someone like that? Okay, and especially a family member. Now, that's not this particular topic, but just to let you all know that don't know, that's what was going on back in the day. Okay, but the original intent for these mental institutions, for these educational schools, it was for the reset population as they moved folks around from one place to another to create a fake historical timeline and to switch identities. Okay? And that's why today we have people from Asia saying they are indigenous American Indians. And people, if your skin is melanated, aka black, you think you are from Africa. Not understanding that your origins could be European or could be indigenous to the Americas or could be both. Okay? To also set up the construct of white supremacy, meaning that the white Caucasian population was the ones that set up this entire structure that we see today. All right, so let's get into it. So this first particular source is from something called Black Past, and this is the Colored Orphans Asylum of New York. Now, New Yorkers, I want you to take note, because as I was doing the research for this, I saw a lot of re-educational schools in New York. So it's not surprising to me that I'm seeing this Colored Orphans Asylum. And the reason I'm saying New Yorkers pay close attention, because of course New York is in that region where the original 13 colonies happened, and New York is a major point of entry for the immigrants coming from New York. Coming from Europe. Okay? So that would make sense that New York would have a lot of re-educational schools, i.e. those Indian schools, as well as orphanages. Okay? So let's get into this. The Colored Orphans Asylum of New York, 1836 to 1946. There was much racial unrest in New York City, New York in the early 1800s, as immigrants from across Europe and migrants from neighboring states arrived in the city. So just as I said, slavery, okay, so of course, there's the hijack. Okay, so we're not saying that slavery did not happen. We're definitely saying it did not happen the way they are telling you it happened. Okay? So meaning slavery, this term, they're using it as a broad stroke to mean black folk coming from Africa, when we know the records do not state that. What the records say is that you had a combination of Europeans, black, coming into the Americas either by force, so meaning they were sentenced from a prison sentence, being kicked out of Europe and banished to one of the American colonies to serve out their prison sentence. And then you had folks that came over under indentured servant contracts. Okay? Then you had mixed in there prisoners of war, meaning the indigenous people of the Americas fighting in all of these Indian wars, being held captive. You could certainly call that slavery. And then the last category, of course, is what they traditionally broad stroke as slavery, with the coming out of Africa. Okay? And even that particular coming out of Africa, you have to take that by an individual level and look at the ship manifest to see even those folks that they said coming out of Africa, were they even originally Europeans? Okay? Because what we do know based on the records is that the largest group coming from Africa from a slave capacity perspective did not hit the mainland American shores. They hit the South American shores, okay, through that Portuguese slave trade, okay. All right, so I always have to put that out there, and we have plenty of videos on this particular channel, and I'll drop a link to the transatlantic slave trade drop that we did, where we go into details. All right. Okay, so slavery was abolished in New York State in 1827. Although Black New Yorkers were free, many of their families were broken because of the sale of parents or children. Is that really the reason? Or was it because of wars these babies were orphaned? Or, as I sip my water, was it because these Black children were snatched off the streets of Europe and brought over to the Americas? I'll run that for the slow ones in the back. Go do your history as Europe was cleaning up their population from orphans and the poor, and children were being snatched off the street and shipped around the world. But let's continue. But see, they want to tell you that's the story just for white children. But we'll continue. And it absolutely happened to white children as well. But we'll continue. General poverty among all ex-slaves and many free Blacks also meant families could not afford to stay together. There was a need for shelter and schooling for numerous Black children in the city. As a consequence, and here we go, right on schedule. Here we go, right on schedule on who had to manage the poor population. Right on schedule as usual. As a consequence, 25 people, mostly who? Quakers, Presbyterians, and other abolitionists, founded the Colored Orphans Asylum of New York. We consistently see Quakers, Puritans, they have Presbyterians in here, and Protestants in the story of either doing missionary work, educating the indigenous population, or serving as caretakers for said orphanages. And throw the Catholic Church up in there as well. Go look at the records on immigrants coming into the country, and you'll see these organizations having children with them. And specifically in those records, you'll see where those children are listed as servants. And that's Black and white children. The white children start showing up in their records in the 1800s. But let's continue. The first building was purchased in 1836 and was located at 12th and 5th Avenue in Manhattan. It housed 11 children. It was managed by 3 of the founding members, Hannah and Anna Shotwell and Mary Murray. The organization moved in 1843 to a large 4-story home at 43rd and 5th Avenue. Dr. James McCune Smith, the nation's first child. Woo! See, I was gonna click in and see if dude was melanated, but they already done told me. Dr. James McCune Smith, the nation's first licensed black medical doctor, became the Orphanage medical director in 1846. The asylum housed anywhere from 200 to 800 children at any given time in the antebellum period. By this point, fewer than a third of the children were orphans, and about of 12 years of age, many were returned to their parents or placed in position as what? They were placed in position as what? They was placed in position as what? Farm laborers or domestic servants. So, like I said, when you look at the records, those immigration records, and you see the Quakers, any of those church organizations or religious organizations, and you see them with children on those immigrant records, what did I just tell y'all them babies were listed as? Indentured servants. Let's continue. In the summer of 1863, New York City experienced the draft riots, the largest urban uprising in the nation's history. On the morning of July 13, 1863, a mostly Irish mob took to the streets and began burning buildings, smashing windows, and pulling up cobblestones in the streets. The mob proceeded through the streets to the Orphans' Asylum and broke into the building with pickaxes. They trashed and ransacked the building before setting it on fire. While the mob was forced on breaking into the building, the superintendent of the asylum, William E. Davis, and the head matron, Jane McClellan, quietly led 233 children out the back entrance. A crew of firefighters of Hook and Ladder Company No. 2 valiantly fought the flames. Two firemen, Chief Engineer Decker and Patty McCaffrey, showed exceptional bravery, trying in vain to put out the fire while fighting the angry mob. The children were taken to the 12th Precinct building, which was located on 35th Street near 7th Avenue, where they remained for the next 3 days until the riots ended. At least 120 people were taken out, and more than 2,000, all mostly African American, were injured. The children from the Orphans' Asylum, however, were moved to Blackwell's Island, now Roosevelt Island, along with many other African American refugees. African American refugees whose homes had been burned by the mob. All asylum children survived the riots, and after a short time at Governor's Island, they were moved to a residence in Carmensville. So, why did folks go and burn down this orphanage? Oh, okay. But let's continue. I mean, they're not saying why they burnt down that orphanage. Could it be that these babies were being snatched off the street from Europe, brought over to the Americas for the sole purpose of being indentured servants? And who's to say they weren't snatching indigenous American children off the street and placing them in these orphanages as well? Because it doesn't make sense to me. Now, this is just my logic. It does not make sense to me that an organization that was supposedly and allegedly set up to help children without parents was burned to the ground by an angry mob. And don't think that it was missed upon me that it was an Irish mob. I thought they told us that Irish people were Caucasian. So why would a Caucasian population go and burn down a black orphanage? Because they are lying. This Irish mob was a black Irish mob. And they burned it to the ground because black Irish children were kidnapped and being put into indentured servitude. Let me back that for the slow ones in the back. Why would a white mob... Now remember, this is 1863. Why would a white mob go and burn down a black orphanage? No, that doesn't make sense. That logic ain't making sense. But a black Irish mob, that makes sense. Them going down and burning down a black orphan asylum that housed black Irish children. That makes sense. Those children that were being trained and put into indentured servitude. Farm laborers or domestic servants. The asylum was rebuilt in 1867 at 143rd Street and Amsterdam Avenue, and in 1907 was relocated again to Riverdale section of the Bronx. In 1944, the associated name was changed to Riverdale's Children's Association. The asylum went through several moves and name changes until 1988, when the West Side Children for Family Services, as it was known, merged with Harlem Dowling Children's Services, which is still in existence today. So New Yorkers, if you are familiar with those organizations that they named up in here, now you know the origins. And what I am telling you, now this is still my theory, I'm just using simple logic. These colored orphans were black European children. Okay? And they probably had some indigenous American Indian children in here as well. But the majority of them, this seems like black European babies to me. And with the Irish mob, they just said Irish mob. I'm telling you, that was a black Irish mob, burnt it to the ground. When they found out what they were doing, snatching them babies off the streets of Europe, training them up to go into indentured servant as farm laborers or domestic servants. Okay, so that's the first one. This is from Black Past. The Colored Orphanage Asylum of New York, 1836 to 1946. Okay? So also shout out to a YouTube channel called Mind Unveiled. He does a lot of work on the reset. He also talked about the different asylums. And his last piece talking about the asylums sparked me to put it together that, wait a minute, when we talk about resets and when we're talking about these asylums, these orphanages, these schools, this was a mass re-education across the world for everyone. So that's including melanated people, indigenous to the Americas, European, indigenous to Europe, Asia, the people that they call the Native Americans now. Yeah, that group of people, as well as Caucasian folks. Everyone was a part of the re-education / resetting of the history in order to swap out identities and set up the narrative of the system of white supremacy. All right, so let's get into the other orphanage. All right, let me see which one I want to go to first. Let's get into the Orphan Trains. So this is one from Noel's Home for Children. You see where it says it was established in 1894. Facts about the Orphan Train movement. America's largest child migration. And what I want you all to notice throughout this, these dates where these babies are being moved around, black, brown, and white, they are around the same exact dates. Between 1854 and 1929, nearly 250,000 orphan children were resettled under what came to be known as the Orphan Train movement. The goal of the movement was to get homeless and destitute children off the street of New York and resettle them with families in the rural Midwest. Okay? But of course, what they are leaving out, where were those children originally from? Europe. They were originally from Europe. Remember, New York is a main port of entry from Europe. Many of the immigrants coming to New York in the mid to late 1800s were poor and could not adequately care for their families. And remember, those who rock with me as we're going through this information about what slavery really is, when the Caucasian population start taking over from a time frame, I told you that the information lines up. I always tell you mid-1800s. And so now they're telling you what? That they had a bunch of immigrants coming to New York, and we're specifically this immigrant population we're talking about are Caucasian children coming from Europe to the Americas in the mid-1800s. It lines up. Because prior to that, the Caucasians did not have a large population. Benjamin Franklin told you that. He said everywhere he looked around, it was swarthy. It's swampy around the world. The only newcomers are the red man, them Asians, and Caucasians. And it's very little of them. So again, many of the immigrants coming to New York in the mid to late 1800s were poor and could not adequately care for their families. This is when the white population started coming to the Americas in droves. They were children, and I am telling you, although this is still my opinion, I'm just using logic. This is the white reset population that was educated to say they held the seat of power. They were the rulers in Europe and over here. But let's continue. Many children ended up on the street with no home. In 1849, New York's chief of police decided to bring attention to the street children, as the city simply did not have the infrastructure and services to deal with thousands of homeless children. That's the same line they gave in Europe, in Ireland, and in London, to clean their streets up with these children. This is the same exact logic they used. This resulted in children being placed in orphanages and some eventually becoming orphan train riders. In the mid-1800s, many children in New York lived in poverty with parents who abused alcohol, engaged in criminal activity, and were otherwise unfit parents. Again, this is the same logic they used in Europe, in Ireland, and England to snatch up those babies. It's the same exact logic. Because these are the same exact children coming from Europe. So when they hit the shores, they wasn't wandering no streets of no New York, baby. They were divvying them up and placing them in these orphanages, getting them prepped for adoption. Getting them prepped for adoption to go work as laborers on these farms. That land that had been granted, or that land that adult white folks on them indentured serving contracts from Europe came over for better opportunities to work the land. Or some of those same black Europeans that came on those indentured serving contracts needed laborers. Yeah, that part. This is the same population. Many of these unwanted kids, I hate to say kids, children, have been in trouble with the law. Again, this is the same story they told over in Europe. But many were orphaned when their parents died in epidemics. So they list all of the stuff that the parents died of. And I'm not saying that the parents didn't die of this. But that was very few. These children, all of these children, the mass of these children were not wandering the streets of New York. Yes, they came as immigrants for the purpose of being reshifted to populate the Americas. According to an essay written by Brace in 1872, one crime and poverty-ridden area around 10th Avenue was referred to as Misery Row. Misery Row was considered to be a main breeding ground of crime and poverty, and inevitably fever nests where disease spread easily. Okay, this is literally, family, the same story that they gave in Europe. The same story, the same justification for snatching these babies up and shipping them out of Europe. Orphans or runaways found themselves drifting into this destitute area, as well as the old sheds of 18th and 19th streets. Such was the severity of child poverty in 1854 that the number of homeless children in New York was estimated as high as 34,000. They were referred often to as street urchins. The Orphan Train movement was a supervised welfare program that transferred orphan and homeless children from crowded eastern cities of the United States to foster homes largely located in the rural of the Midwest. So let me just break this down to y'all. They're lying. These are the immigrant children that they snatched off the streets from Europe. And the reason a lot of them was in New York, because that was their point of entry, or any of those eastern cities. So Virginia, I'm sure Virginia probably has a lot of records also of these orphan children. Those were the points of entry. So there was already a plan when they put those babies on those ships from Europe to come to the United States. The plan was to populate the Americas with these babies and populate the Americas with a white population. So build up the Americas with a white population, and these babies can also serve as laborers / indentured servants. So yes, in the rural areas of the Midwest and all of that, yes, because they were trying to build up / populate these areas, i.e. a reset. The Orphan Trains operated between 1853 and 1929, relocating about 200,000 orphan, abandoned, or homeless children. 3 charitable institutions: Children's Village, founded 1851 by 24 philanthropists. The Children's Aid Society. I want y'all to keep in mind these dates. And keep in mind what was going on around these dates. The Children's Aid Society, established 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, and later the New York Foundling Hospital was put in charge to help these children. Endeavored to help these children. The 2 institutions developed a program that placed homeless, orphaned, and abandoned city children, who numbered an estimate 30,000 in New York City alone in the 1850s, in foster homes throughout the country. The children were transported to their new homes on trains that were labeled orphan trains or baby trains. This relocation of children ended in the 1920s with the beginning of the organized foster care in America. So for those of you who want to know the origins of foster care, there you go. The orphan trains were needed at the time that they happened. They were not the best answer, just like foster care is not the best answer today. Okay? That's a whole separate topic. The orphan trains were needed at the time they happened. They were not the best answer, but they were the first attempt at finding a practical system. Now, that was already planned. The orphan trains were already planned when they snatched the children off the street of Europe to become the reset population in the Americas. Many children that would have died lived to have children and grandchildren. It has been calculated that over 2 million descendants come from these children. And I'm going to say it's higher than that. It has been, the trains gave the children a fighting chance to grow up. Okay? Now, when you hear orphan trains, you can associate that with Caucasian children. Okay? Have the pictures to back up and prove what they are saying. I am telling you, although this is my opinion, it's backed up with some credible evidence that these children were the reset population. Okay? Just like with the colored orphans, this is my logic. I'm only using logic. That this specific color orphanage in New York were for black/melanated children out of Europe. And what did they say they were training them up to be? Farm laborers or domestic servants. So that ain't too far-fetched from what happened with the white children. Not too far-fetched at all. Okay? Because they pretty much said they were sending them to the Midwest. Okay? And how do we know, based on my logic, regarding this melanated orphanage, that they came from Europe? Because they said an Irish mob burnt that joker down to the ground. And why would a white Irish mob do that? During this same time period, there were white orphanage coming from Europe. No, that was a black Irish mob burning down this orphanage, this black orphanage, because those were black European children. All right? Okay. So let's go a little bit into the history of orphanages or orphan asylums. Now, I found this highly interesting. I did not expect to find the word orphan and asylums together. So this is from the source of Biblical Encyclopedia. Orphanages or orphanage asylums, a term applied to those philanthropic institutions. So who are these philanthropies folk? That's a whole separate conversation within itself. These philanthropic institutions, them Quakers, them Catholics, those Presbyterian them. Then in the other case, the colored orphanage case, they put the the Presbyterians up in there. Those are just those institutions, but there are people behind those institutions that finance it and make the decisions. But nevertheless, the philanthropic institutions which provide a home for orphan children until their education or training has fitted them for safe contact with the world at large. Child, let me sip this water. Fitted them for what now? You say fitted them for what? You mean train them to go work on farms or work as servants? Let's call it for what it is. Train them for a life of indentured servitude. And depending on how young they were, reprogram them on what we're calling today is nationality and true origins were. So, of course, the younger those babies were, the more they could tell them anything. The history of the origin of orphan asylum is very uncertain. Is it not? What the Romans, always gotta be something with the Romans involved, always with the foolery. What the Romans understood by Priory cannot properly be compared to our institution called orphanages. Trajan, who did much to protect orphans, both the Antonius, whatever that is, and Alexander Severus established foundations for them. But such institutions do not seem to have been frequent till the introduction of Christianity, which gave encouragement for the founding of so many institutions beneficial to mankind. You can miss me with that. Because Christianity deemed that it had the right, and the Romans had the same ideology because they're one and the same. But has the ideology that they have the right to go around the world and civilize the indigenous population and indoctrinate them is a part of their civilizing the indigenous people. So those foundations that they set up was not for the benefit of quote, quote, mankind. It was for the benefit of, like it's always been, the rulers. Okay? These organizations are put in place to reprogram and control the population. These programs are put in place to make the populace a better indentured servitude / servant. All right. So it says, which gave encouragement for the founding of so many institutions beneficial to mankind. See asylums. So we just went over the asylums. See hospitals. Yeah, my bad. I forgot to throw hospitals up in there also. In the Middle Ages, orphan asylums became quite frequent especially in thriving and opulent cities of the continent. And enactments were secured in the church. They go to church, always involved in some foolery, to take proper care of children bereaved of their parents. So when we talk about ward of the state, I hope you all, those that rock with us, you all should be getting a very clear picture of how deep this really goes. In Germany and Italy, many orphanages date from the 16th and the 17th centuries. But by far, the most famous of the institutions which originated in that period is the orphan house at, I want to say this is Halle, founded by A.H. Frankel in 1698. In many respects, it is the most noted of all orphanages. The orphan house, founded at Ashley Down near Bristol, England by George Muller, stands perhaps second on the list. Okay, so again, this was laying out the blueprint for what they ultimately brought to the Americas. Both these institutions are noted not only for their intensive orphan labors. Let me sip on this water, because I hope you're seeing a consistent theme here. Orphans, laborers, really? Let's continue. And missionary, and they about to say this in the next sentence. Both of these institutions are noted not only for their extensive orphan laborers, but also for their missionary enterprise at home and abroad. This was a worldwide program. This was put in place to reset populations around the world. As the pillaging was going on around the world of the indigenous people, they brought in new populations. Let's continue. But while the former has largely devoted itself to educational and business enterprises, I ain't making this up. This is what they saying, and they list their little sources. Mueller's single and small orphan house, founded in 1836 on his own premises, has grown to 5 orphanages, each one of extensive proportions, and each filled its utmost capacity with indigent beneficiaries, and all these supported, not as in the former, by endowment and traffic, but by asking for contributions to Mueller, all as he believed in answering to prayer and faith. Again, y'all can miss me with this foolery, because he was financed with hidden hands to set this up. So y'all can miss me with this. He was just the front person. The 5 orphanage buildings have cost over $500,000. The balance of the receipts has gone to meet the current expenses during the 37 years of history of the enterprise. Whatever has been received beyond what has been needed for present use has not been funded for possible future need, for no future lack has been apprehended, but has been immediately applied in the missionary work in various parts of the country. There go that missionary work. As many as 150 missionaries have been aided by the surplus, in quotes, funds During the year ending May 26, 1874, Mueller received 37, I think that's pounds, y'all. I don't know what that equates to, so don't even quote me on that, y'all. With which 189 missionary and 122 schools were supported in whole or part. 2,261 orphans maintained, and 47,000 Bibles or parts of the Bible and 3.7 million tracts and books distributed. So does that seem like a small fate to you all? Are you all getting the picture? That these orphanages were set up to ship these babies around the world for a repopulation program. And they did it under the guise of missionary work / helping humanity. Okay? Now, remember, we're in Europe. I ain't in the Americas right now. We're giving you the origins of these orphanages. Okay? So, again, this is just my theory with these orphanages, these babies being the repopulation. But it's lining up pretty good. Where they're shipping these babies from their particular homeland out of Europe to the Americas, the mainland, and them Caribbean islands. And who's to say all of those children in Europe, those orphans, were even originally from Europe? They could have been from different locations around the world. They could have been from Asia and Africa. But let's continue. From the beginning up to May 1874, he had instructed, let me make sure you all can see. Yep, you can see. Just making sure you can see what I see. From the beginning up to May 1874, he had instructed in all 38,000 children in various schools, entirely supported by the institution, as Mr. Mueller is pleased to designate it. Besides the tens of thousands benefited in other schools assisted by its funds, not only in great child. Woo! So blood finna sit up and tell you the reach of these orphanages. Great Britain, Spain, Italy, India, and the British Guyana. Seems like my theory lining up pretty well here. Added to this, more than 467,000 Bibles and Testaments in various languages and 50 million religious, not 50,000, y'all, not 500,000, 50 million religious tracts have been issued and distributed through its agency. 190 missionaries supported year by year, and 4,408 orphans brought up. In most of the institutions, the care of the orphan is relinquished only to competent persons, usually one following a trade. There it goes again. So these babies are in these orphanages to be programmed / educated, and to learn a trade to become indentured servants. And only, and you know, when we talk about that programming, that means the religious indoctrination. That also means, depending on how young you are, telling you what your identity is. Only until all of that criteria is met. But you better know a trade before you leave up out of this door, because, see, we have to place you with the family to be a servant. The boy or girl, however, is more or less under the eye of the orphanage until the apprenticeship is satisfactory, complete. I don't care how you want to say it. I don't care if you want to say apprenticeship. I don't care if you want to say trade. It don't matter. You were prepping them to go into the workforce, i.e. indentured servitude. The Jews, noted for their philanthropy labors, have adopted this Christian institution and have founded several large organizations. So they talked about the Christian institutions. Now they're talking about the Jewish institutions. Okay. They adopted the same thing, huh? Okay. One of their most noted is at Berlin, called the Asherbashi. I ain't trying to pronounce all that, child. The question of most consequences in relation to the public support of orphans is whether it is best in a moral, physical, and economic point of view to bring up large number of orphans in great establishments where they live together, or to put them out singly in trustworthy families paid by the community. In Germany, this question was long and thoroughly discussed, and for a time the majority favored home training. The asylum advocates have finally got the control, and orphanages are fast multiplying. It sure is a lot of orphans running around. Sure is a lot of orphans running around the world. Where are these babies' parents? Oh, I forgot. They all drunk, in jail, all of that part. They couldn't even lie to us and at least say through war. Most of where they couldn't even throw in war is what I'm trying to say. Let me restate that. They couldn't even throw in war. They're trying to convince you that these babies' parents, they was all drunk and just laid to so-and-so out. Not through war. Or locking up their parents, or their parents themselves been shipped off to different parts of the world. Not any of that. Okay, then. Most of the governments of Europe now support orphanages, institutions founded by private charity. In many cases, receive aid from the government if they stand in need of it. In the United States, orphans received great consideration. We have distinguished three classes. Number one, those supported by the national government. Number two, those supported by single states. Number three, those supported by private, especially church charity. One of the most successful of the last named is the Howard Mission of New York. There we go in New York again. A modern orphanage on British soil is that of Ardington, founded by Hosea Mason. Mason, huh? At an expense of $1.5 million and supporting over 300 orphans. So a lot of orphans. So again, this is from the source Biblical Encyclopedia, Orphanages and Asylums. Okay? So now we've shown you orphanages from the colored perspective out of New York. From the Caucasian perspective, the Orphan Train starting in where? Starting in New York. In New York. And now we're giving you the origins of orphanages coming out of where? Out of Europe. Okay? And where did they say? How far did these orphanages out of Europe, how far of a reach? Who was benefiting? Not only Great Britain, but Spain, Italy, India, and British Guyana. Yeah. Now that's the orphanages. We went into the insane asylums. I'm just going to real quick hit up what they was doing to the parents. We started out this. I was sharing a story with you with she's an ancestor now that I heard as a little girl about how people were using insane asylums as a weapon. So let's not sleep on the fact that you had insane asylums during this time period as well that were being stood up for adults. Okay? So this is from Psychology Today, The American Mental Asylum, a Remnant of History. Now note, this also went on in Europe. Okay, and I'll jump over in Wikipedia in a second to just give you a high level of its origins. But let's focus on the Americas right now. The massive state hospitals of yesteryear are a piece of psychiatric history. Growing up as a boy in northern New Jersey, my first encounter with psychiatry was driving with my grandparents past a large, imposing hospital complex in Essex County called Overbrook. Built in a cottage style, the hospital center was comprised of various buildings spread out over a beautiful rolling hill of Cedar Grove, New Jersey. Okay, so he gives us, I'm just going to blow this up, a picture of this hospital. Now, this more than likely was a repurposed building. Shout out to the mud flood community. Just like most hospitals back then, most what we're calling schools, most what they were calling prisons, which to this day, a lot of those prisons still stand in those same old world buildings. So in other words, these buildings were not built for the original purpose that they were using them and what they're using them today. Because the history that they are telling us is a lie. It's false. They're giving it to us in spurts. They're piecing it together. But let's continue. Overbrook was just one of the several asylums in northern and central New Jersey that were still in operation when I was a boy, including Greystone Park and Morris Plain and Marlborough State Hospital in Monmouth County. Like most American asylums, all three closed permanently in the late 1990s and 2000. Surely did. The mass closure of state mental hospitals in the United States coincided with the advent and popularity of neuroleptic medications, the patient right movement. Okay, patient rights movement. Remember I was telling you that story I heard as a little girl of folks being locked up by family members when they didn't need to be locked up? And well-intended but poorly delivered national transition towards community-based mental health care. All right. At one point in the 1950s, more than 500,000 Americans were confined to state psychiatric institutions, many of them for life. Today, the total number of state psychiatric beds in the United States sits around 37,000. So do y'all see the huge jump from 500,000? Now, this was just in the 1950s. That ain't going back to the 1800s. I'm sure that had to be a huge number. Okay, so, but we're going to take it from what he's saying. So from the 1950s, from 500,000 folks down to only 37,000. With most beds on short-term acute inpatient units in general medical hospitals. The state mental hospital occupies a position of great importance in the history of American psychiatry. Their grand architecture and historical value reflect a special era of psychiatry, even with its shortcomings. These magnificent buildings, you think they built the magnificent buildings for psych patients? I don't think so. And the psychiatric beds once contained within them are dwindling as the years pass. Their history must be preserved. Best known as a tireless advocate for psychiatric care for the poor and disenfranchised, Dorothea Dix is chiefly responsible for the mass construction of state mental hospitals in the U.S. in the 1800s. Again, they did not construct those buildings in the 1800s just to house the mentally ill. You can miss me with that. Because the pictures that you show us, they was on horse and buggies. So you can miss me with that. Those buildings were much older. And it was just repurposed. But we gonna move on. Well, here we go. I hope you all are starting to get the theme. Now, again, it's just my theory. This just my theory. But my theory's being backed up by a lot of facts. Waves of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Italy led to rapid population growth, prompting a greater need for appropriate medical and psychiatric treatment. Huh? So you just saying that people coming from Europe, you just saying they was straight up crazy? No, bruh. No. Y'all was locking people up who wasn't going on, who was not going along with your reset program. Dix, a hero in the field of social work, cited the mental health of citizenry to be a vital importance to the state. So those of you that understand the terms of citizen, state, ward of the state, I want y'all to sip on that tea. The American Mental Asylum was born. A second influential figure in the history of the American Psychiatric Hospital is Thomas Story Kirkbride. A Pennsylvania psychiatrist, Kirkbride founded the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for an Insane Group, a group that later became the American Psychiatric Association. He is best known as the originator of the Kirkbride Plan for the construction of state mental hospitals. Kirkbride hospitals represent the most classic and numerous of the asylums constructed in the 19th century. Okay, so his model was just the 19th century. But it was already an establishment prior to that. The structure features of Kirkbride hospitals reflected Dr. Kirkbride's approach to treating mental illness, which emphasized exposure to natural light and proper air circulation. Okay, so I'm just trying to jump to cure of lunacy. Okay, so I'm not going to go through what he did because he just set the precedence for rebranding mental institutions from the 1900s forward, which even with him rebranding, they were still doing a lot of foolery with those mental institutions. So if you all are not familiar, because remember, they closed them down across the United States starting in the 1990s and finally completed in the early 2000s, which I'm shocked, y'all, to be honest. I thought they were closed down in the 80s and 90s. Okay? But if y'all want to get an insight into the 20th century, what was going on in those mental institutions, go watch a movie called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And that's with Jack Nicholson. Go check it out. It is, when I tell you that movie, go check it out. For those of you that have seen it, y'all know what I'm talking about. And get your box of Kleenex. It's a very entertaining movie, but it's a tearjerker for sure. Okay? So let's just jump over to Wikipedia. We finna to just get into these lunatic asylums, and I'm just going to give you the high level of what was going on. The lunatic asylums, alternatively, the mental asylum or insane asylum, was an early precursor to the modern psychiatric hospital. The fall of the lunatic asylum and its eventual replacement by modern psychiatric hospitals explains the rise of organized institutional psychiatry. While there were earlier institutions that housed the insane, the conclusion that institutionalization was the correct solution to treating people considered to be mad was part of the social process in the 19th century that began to seek solution outside the families and local communities. Okay, so we even know then that mental asylums date back further than the 19th century. Okay, medieval era. In the Islamic world, the Burmestrians were described by European travelers who wrote about their wonder at the care and the kindness shown to lunatics. So in 872, Ahmad Toulon built a hospital in Cairo that provided care to the insane, which included music therapy. Nonetheless, physical historian Roy Porter cautioned against idealizing the role of hospitals generally in medieval Islam, stating that they were a drop in the ocean for the vast population that they had to serve, and that their true function lay in highlighting ideals of compassion and bringing together the activity of medical professions. Okay, then. It sure was, according to them, a lot of mentally insane folks running around. The vast population that they had to serve. What's making everybody so mass insane, according to you all? According to them. In Europe during the medieval era, a small subsection of the population of those considered mad were housed in a variety of institutional settings. Porter gives examples of such locales where some of the insanes were cared for, such as what? Monasteries. A few towns had towers where madmen were kept. The ancient Persian hospital, oh wow, they named it hotel. Ooh, look how big that is, fam. That's big. The Hotel Dieu, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, is a hospital located on the Ile de la Cité in the fourth, whatever that is, of Paris on the Parvis of Notre Dame. Baby, I can't make this up. I was trying to blow up that picture. We can't make this stuff up. Child. Clutch pearls, clutch pearls. It was supposedly founded by Saint Landry in 651 AD, making it the oldest hospital in the city. So you mean to tell me this hospital / insane asylum set on the campus of Notre Dame? Child, if they don't stop playing with me with this foolery, they better. Well, I'm not going to get sidetracked. I'm going to stick with this. Okay, so the ancient Parisian hospital, Hotel Dieu, also had a small number of cells set aside for lunatics, whilst the town of Elbing boasted a madhouse. Attached to the Toll House, attached to the Teutonic Knights Hospital. Dave Shepard's development of mental health law and practice begins in 1285 with the case that linked the instigation of the devil with being frantic and mad. Okay, so we do know that also one of the tactics were to say that folks was practicing witchcraft, specifically women, and they were possessed. So you see where I'm going with this? Those women in their indigenous culture that were deemed oracles, or the men that were deemed medicine men and also medicine women, you know, they also deemed those indigenous people mentally insane. In Spain, other such institutions for the insane were established after the what? See, I never miss. So in Spain, other institution for the insane was established during the Christian, I'm going to say, colonization revolt. or Reconquista was a period in which the history of the Iberian Peninsula of about 781 years of war between the Umayyad conquest of Hispaniola in 711, the expansion of the Christian kingdom, and the fall of the Nasrid kingdom of Granada in 1492. So now, they established that when? You mean after a war had broke out? So my theory, although it's still a theory, seeming to line up pretty good, that they're standing up these orphanages, these insane asylums, and we're going to get to the schools last, as reprogramming centers, and specifically with the children, reprogramming them, training them for indentured servants or servitude to repopulate their colonies. So, these facilities included hospitals in Valencia, 1407, Zaragoza, 1425, Seville, 1436, Barcelona, 1481, and Toledo, 1483. In London, England, the Priory of St. Mary of Bethlehem, which later became notoriously as Bethlehem, was founded in 1247. At the start of the 15th century, it housed 6 insane men. The former lunatic asylum, Het del Huis, established in the 16th century in Haarlem. So Haarlem, you want to know where you got that name from? Haarlem, from the Netherlands. Okay, so established in the 16th century in Haarlem, the Netherlands has been adapted as a museum of psychiatric, with an overview of treatments from the origins of the building up to the 1990s. Okay. I'm not going to go into the rest of this because it's going to talk about reform, but I wanted to give you the history to show you this is a worldwide system. And I am telling you, although this is just my theory, it's lining pretty, my theory is lining up to be the truth with these facts, with these receipts, that these institutions that they set up were set up for the purpose of a reset population. So those that lost the war, that wasn't cooperating, that didn't want to assimilate, that didn't want to go along with the new plan, they locked their behinds right on up if they didn't get taken out. Those children whose parents were locked up or shipped off to different parts of the world as indentured servants, they were put in orphanages. So the last part we talked about, and I'll drop a link as well to that video when we talked about the miseducation of the American Indian. And we talked about in that particular podcast how they had a plan to re-educate Indian children. So I just wanted to give a couple more examples because you can put that in a part of the reprogramming/resetting of the population. This was worldwide. All cultures, all nationalities/races were a part of this. So now we're going to get into the freedmen's education in Virginia. Now I want y'all to make note of Virginia. One of those original 13 colonies. One of those original 13 colonies set up by a melanated man, ruled over a melanated European empire. But let's continue. So this source is the Encyclopedia Virginia. Freedmen's education in Virginia, 1861 to 1870. Virginia freed slaves. There go that freed slaves again. We already talked about that. Sought education for themselves and their children at the earliest opportunity. Shortly after the Civil War began in Virginia, African Americans established and taught schools for Virginia's freed people. An African American Virginian created the first black secondary school in the state. More than 1/3 of the teachers at the Virginia first black schools between 1861 and the end of the Reconstruction were African Americans. And black teachers taught far longer in freedmen schools in Virginia than white teachers, northern, or southern. Not only were African Americans the first to teach in primary schools for Virginia's freed people, they also founded and staffed the first secondary school in the state for free blacks. Northern aid societies like the there go again. I ain't making this up. See, I ain't got to lie, Craig. I ain't got to lie. Northern aid societies like the American Missionary Association sent teachers, books, and other educational support to Virginia's early black schools. And the federal government provided building materials for schools and transportation for Northern teachers through the Bureau of Refugees. Freedmen, child, and abandoned lands, popularly known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Many historians have portrayed freedmen's education as a northern white benevolent effort, a white gift to black South. Although many northerner teachers braved remarkably aggressive circumstances in their service, evidence suggests that black education in Virginia, as elsewhere in the South, was a product of freed people's own initiative and determination, temporarily supported by Northern benevolence and federal aid. So what they are telling you is blacks establish the Freedmen School. Not whites, blacks. And whom were those blacks, we might add? Were they the black Europeans? Who may we say funded these efforts? May we say the black Europeans, whom were part of the repopulation / reset program. So starting to teach these babies that they were slaves, Yeah, that's the thunder and the elements agreeing with that. All right, so let's continue. Virginia had long outlawed the education of enslaved African Americans, passing increasingly oppressive legislation in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Education posed a dual threat to the state. First, they might read and embrace the American Revolution's expectation of human equality. Second, they contradicted one of the ideological foundations of slavery, the presumed intellect and capacity of Africans and those of African descent, and the consequences necessary for protection by the superior race. BS, BS, BS. These schools were set up to program the reset population. So not that these black children, these freedmen, because we're on the freedmen now. Not that these freedmen children origins were from black Europe. You came from Africa. Not that your folks came over either on prison sentences or came over as indentured servants, as laborers / workers on a contract. Now, y'all came from Africa. Those who supported slavery understood that ignorant people can, I'm not going over that. Although some Virginians had once supported the idea of black education, by the 19th century, slave insurrection and rumors thereof had halted any movement toward increased slave literacy. The slave revolt in Haiti, Gabrielle's conspiracy, 1800, the thwarted plan by enslaved African Americans to siege Richmond and end slavery in Virginia led to legislation in Virginia in 1804 that outlawed nighttime assemblage of slaves, and further laws in 1805 that prohibited the secular education of black apprentices. In April, so outlawing the apprentices in 1805, the black apprentices, because by then it was time to start bringing in, because they knew they were going to bring in those white Caucasian orphanages to repopulate all of the Americas. Okay? So they needed some of those apprenticeship to also be for those white children, although they didn't start until the mid 1800s. So, 45 years later? Okay, so that's why they put them laws in place. So, in other words, black Europeans, you out. Now we bringing in the white Europeans. Because y'all set up on y'all behind. You came over here under prison sentences and under labor contracts. And y'all done kicked it and married in with the indigenous Indians. And y'all turned around and fought against your own country land. I effing dare you. I dare you. So since you don't want to cooperate, we got something for you. You're going to be replaced with some new immigrants. They're going to be white Caucasians. And we finna reset this history. Notice the pattern. When they can't get the indigenous population to do what they want them to do, or the immigrants that they use to not popularize, but to populate and to labor, they just bring in more immigrants. But let's continue. In April 1831, 5 months prior to Nat Turner's rebellion, the General Assembly prohibited African Americans from assembling in schools for the purpose of education. Turner's slave revolt in August spawned even greater efforts by whites to discourage black education. Okay. It was impossible to quash black education entirely, of course. Free blacks and slaves continued to secretly share what literacy they had. Clandestine schools operated in nearly every city and large towns in the state. Some in cities such as Alexandria and Hampton were not particularly secret. As long as the teachers and students were circumspect about their activities, authorities looked the other way. Okay, so in other words, as long as it was sanctioned that they could be in existence, it ain't no smoke here. It is doubtful, however, that more than 5 to 10% of Virginia's African Americans had access to literacy before the war. Right? So, Freedmen's Education, 1861 to 1865. Although historians often give credit to white Northerners for educating free people within days of beginning of the Civil War in Virginia, African Americans themselves established the first freely accessible schools for African Americans. Okay, so just to be clear, they telling you, white folks didn't set that up. Okay? They're being clear with you. As soon as Union forces secured their city, Alexandria teachers Mary Chase, Jane Crouch, and Annabelle Davis, black women who had once conducted classes in secret began to openly teach. Sarah Gray opened another school in Alexandria during the summer. Mary Peake, long mistakenly credited as the first black teacher to teach openly in Virginia, established a school in Hampton in September at the insistence of black refugees fleeing from plantations to freedom on the peninsula. African Americans were teaching in Norfolk, Fort Monroe, and Yorktown by October 1861. 16 of the 24 teachers in black schools in the first year of black self-emancipation were African Americans. Only 1 out of 8 northern white teachers who taught in the first year remained in the schools for more than 1 year. You want to know why that number was so low? Because it wasn't that many white people. White people just started coming into play in the 1850s. While all but one of those 16 black teachers taught for multiple years. 2, Crouch and Gray taught continuously from 1861 through 1870. Gray continued to teach in the Alexandria until shortly before her death in 1893. So she taught a long time. The number of schools and teachers increased greatly in the second year of the war. Through open access to black education remained limited to schools in Alexandria and the peninsula until 1865. The number of northern teachers in Virginia grew rapidly after 1861. In 1862 to 63, 85 teachers were active in Virginia's black schools, about 60 of whom were Northerners, including 5 Northern African American teachers. 3 years later, after the war ended, more than 450 teachers taught nearly 12,000 black students in Virginia. African Americans were not only the first primary school teachers in Virginia, they also founded and staffed first secondary school in the state. Clement Robinson, a former slave from Petersburg who had studied at Pennsylvania Ashman Institute, established a Beulah Norman and Theological School in 1862 in Alexandria, the first of 14 black normal schools and high schools founded in Virginia before 1870, the end of Reconstruction. All right, so I'm going to skip around because I got a couple other things I want to go over. So from 1862 into 1865, northern groups, both existing missionary, we can't miss that, missionary societies and new secular freedmen aid societies, organized to send teachers to Virginia and other southern states. Now, who did this? From 1862 and 1865, when that Civil War was popping off. Who did this? The missionary societies, and then the Freedmen's Society. They sent teachers to Virginia and the southern states to provide minimal salaries and to send material aid. Of the 450 teachers in Virginia by the spring of 1875, not quite 1/3 were supported by such secular groups as the New England Freedmen's Aid Society and the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Association, and 1/2 were sustained by northern religious groups such as the American Missionary Association, the American Baptist Home Missionary Society, and the who? The whom? Always there. They never miss, the Quaker organizations. More than 1/6 of the teachers, particularly African American teachers from Virginia, taught independently of any external aid. Freedmen education, Freedmen's Education, 1865 to 1870. In March 1865, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, properly known as the Freedmen Bureau. As its former name indicates, it was intended to achieve more than aiding the freed people. Its first task was directed towards the problems of all war refugees, white and black. So let me sip on this water, baby. I want y'all to reread that again, and on that white and black. Don't skip the part when they talk about who was in the Freedmen Bureau. The war refugees, white and black. See, I already had knew this because I looked at the actual Freedmen Bureau records. When I was doing my genealogy, I cross-referenced those Freedmen Bureau records and that particular areas my ancestors were in to see if they were listed on them Freedmen Bureau records, and they were not, by the way. But I saw white people on there as well. But let's continue. It was intended as well to attend what was expected to be another major problem created by the war: the disposition of property abandonment by or confiscated from planters and property owned by the Confederate government and seized by the Union forces at the end of the hostilities. Those lands were essentially to the original design of the Bureau. Congress assumed that the new agency would not require federal funds because it could carry out its work through sale or rentals. You can't make this up. Now, this ain't me, y'all. This not me. This is coming from Virginia NAM's information. So Congress didn't feel they needed to fund it because of what they could do it through the work through the sale or rental of tens of thousands of acres of abandoned and confiscated property. That was not what happened, however. President Andrew Johnson, who opposed the Freedmen's Bureau, weakened the organization by pardoning the majority of former Confederates and restoring their property. That left the Bureau with little real estate with which to carry out its mandate. When the Bureau was renewed in 1866, Congress granted a small appropriation. It gained one more renewal, but was ordered to cease nearly all operations in 1870. In the end, its primary legacy was assistance to Southern Black education. So those of you on this quest for reparations, you better know and understand history, and you better know and better understand it very well. You better look at the patterns. Because every time I hear the conversation of reparations come up, they always link it back to, but we're going to set up some schools. We're going to fund some schools. We're going to give scholarship to some schools. It's the same playbook. And just overall, in general, you're not understanding what you're asking for reparations. Your whole basis, your foundation of reparations is off the mark anyway. You're getting better. You're moving from the slavery narrative from Africa. You are at least moving from that. But you still got a long way to go. But let's continue. The Freedmen's Bureau, however, was not allowed to expend funds on teachers' salaries, school books, or classroom apparatuses. It was limited to encouraging Black communities to raise money to purchase land for school buildings, providing building materials, and abandoned military buildings, transporting teachers to their schools, and paying rent on schoolhouses. Across the South, the Freedmen Bureau helped to educate thousands of Black students who otherwise might have been unable to attend school. At the same time, however, the federal response to emancipation was astoundingly inadequate. First, it was limited entirely to education. I don't miss you all that are having these reparations discussions, and when they keep throwing education up in there and them scholarships, pay attention. That ain't nothing new. They ain't coming up with nothing new. It's the same playbook. Second, its expenditures were meager. The Bureau spent approximately $7 million between 1865 and 1870 in all Southern states on all Bureau activity, which amounts to $1.75 for every Black man, woman, and child in the American South, or 35 cents each per year for the Bureau's 5 years of activity. In Virginia, the Freedmen's Bureau appeared to have expended between $190,000 and $225,000 for education in its 5 years of existence. If the higher number is taken as the total federal expenditure in Virginia, the Freedmen's Bureau spent 44 cents per capita for education of the state's 512,000 Black citizens, or about 9 cents per capita per year. Benevolent aid from northern agencies may have doubled the total funds available to Black education in Virginia from 1865 to 1870. From 1864 to 1869, and particularly after 1867, many of the Northern Aid Societies established high school and normal schools in the state. By the years of the decade, however, Northern benevolence had steeply declined. Nearly all of the secular aid societies had closed their books by 1870, handing off their secondary schools to a few remaining societies or cities that hosted them. Few of those schools survived Reconstruction. The missionary societies fared only moderately better than the secondary schools. Of course, the missionary societies did better. Okay? Because they had a major part to play in the resetting of the population. Oh, and as well as colonization, which is equivalent to resetting. All had begun to retrench by 1869. 2 years later, they were supporting half as many teachers as they had in 1869. By 1875, the American Missionary Association, which had more than 100 teachers working in Virginia in 1867, could sustain only 21. The Quakers, with 50 teachers in 1867, had 16 in 1875, and the Episcopal Church supported 34 teachers in Virginia in 1867, but only 7 in 1875. Now, shout out for Virginia for putting this out there. Shout out to Virginia. All right, so the misconception about freedmen's education. Historically, white Northern teachers have received most of the credit for establishing and teaching in freedmen's schools in Virginia and throughout the South. In fact, the 1865-1866 school year was the high water mark for Northern teachers in Virginia. 4/5 of the teachers in black schools that year were Northerners, including 30 African Americans from northern states. More than 1/5 of all teachers in Virginia that year were black. The 275 northern teachers accounted for 3/4 of the teachers in black schools in 1866 to 1870, down from the 360 in the prior year. Right, so I'm not going to go through all of that. It's just going through the stats. I think we get the gist of what was going on. Far as whites did not establish the freedmen school, nor were they the primary teachers in said schools. Legacy: despite inadequate funding, enrollment in Virginia's black schools rose steadily from the opening of the first schools in Alexandria in 1861. When the Freedmen's Bureau ceased operations in Virginia and other states. By 1866, nearly 12,000 students were attending schools across the state. By 1868, 19,000 were enrolled. By 1870, the total was nearly 33,000. Okay. So I'm just going to skip down a little bit because I think we're getting the gist of that. Let's see. Before the end of Reconstruction in Virginia in January 1870 and before the demise of the Freedmen Bureau, African Americans took a leading part in creating the state's first school system of free public schools. So if you want to know, in Virginia, how the public schools came about, and I'm just going to go out on a limb, I'm pretty much thinking that's how all of the public school systems got started, with the combination of not only freedmen schools, but those Indian reform schools, those entire concepts for those particular organizations were the foundation for what we now call public schools. Now, again, these initial organizations, these initial schools, within combination of the orphanages, were for the purpose of programming the reset population of the children, whether black or white. Okay? So all they did was chop up the population. So meaning the Caucasian white orphanages, the colored orphanages, which appear to be primarily with Black European children. And now you have the schools. So the freedmen schools with Black European children. And then we're going to get into the other Black/melanated schools that they labeled African American schools, were the melanated indigenous children as well as Black European children in those schools. And then you had the Indian schools, which some of those were exclusively Black melanated children as well. And then you had the population of what are known now as the Native American, but their origins and their families were from Asia, the Native American schools. So either way you slice it, it was the reprogramming of the children because they were the reset population. They were going to be the generations that carry forward the narrative that what is taught today on what slavery is, what the system of white supremacy is, what its origins are, and how the nationalities originated. All right. The Virginia Constitution of 1869, which about 24 African American delegates helped draft, required the General Assembly to create the school system. Earlier state constitution and statutes had authorized cities and counties to establish schools to be supported in part by fines and penalties paid into the State Liberty Fund, established in 1810. Few counties did so, and most of the schools were underfunded in an effort served only to children of poor white families. Okay? Because they were doing this for the come up of the replacement population of labor, which were going to be white families. In 1870, the General Assembly, including about 30 African American members, enacted a comprehensive school law that created the Office of Superintendent of Public Instructions and a state board of education. The law authorized these new offices to support local superintendents and hire teachers for the new school. The new constitution also required the legislature to devote a portion of the state's tax revenue to support the new school system. The foundation for a liberatory Black literacy was laid in Virginia in its first decade of Black freedom. Its architects were Virginia's former slaves, men and women, who were determined that their children would possess the knowledge necessary for freedom and citizenship. Their efforts were made more difficult by attempts by the state government to reassert policies of white supremacy and by a federal government that did not appropriate adequate funds to public education. The education system was left unfinished when the government withdrew its support. Okay? So again, the state governments to reassert policies of white supremacy. I'm going to switch out the word reassert to establish policies of white supremacy. Okay? Because it was swapping out the laborers from Black to white. It was swapping out the seat of power from white to blacks, because those original black Europeans that came over to the Americas, rather through a prison sentence or rather through a work contract called indentured servant contract, sided with them Indians. They married into them Indians' families and fought against Europe. So they reset it and brought in the white population. So meaning that the funding would go to, majority of the funding would go to said white population, the reset population. All right. So this source again is from encyclopediavirginia.org, Freedmen's Education in Virginia, 1861. Okay, so I just have a couple more examples. This particular example, and I'm not going to read through it because they have a copyright notice on it, is from NCpedia, and it talks about the school for freed people. And it's going to go into the same thing about the Civil War and African American and slaves and the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so you can get this on your own and read it. I'll leave a link in the description. Okay, but for copyright purposes, I'm not going to go through this. Okay, just another source. This is from the National Park Service. African Americans in education during Reconstruction, the Tolson Chapel School. Okay, just giving you another example in another area of these reconstructing schools of these quote, quote, African Americans. Okay. All right. So during the and I'm not going to read through all of this. I'm just going to give you the high level because it's going to be the same script. During the Reconstruction era, African Americans in the former slaveholding states saw education as an important step towards achieving equality, independence, and prosperity. As a result, they found ways to learn despite many obstacles that poverty and white people placed in their path. No, white people didn't place that in their path because them white children were being educated also. African Americans committed to education had lasting effects on the former slaveholding states. As voters and legislators, they played crucial roles in creating public schools for blacks and whites in the southern border states in the late 1800s. Remember, I told you whites start taking the seats of power in the mid-1800s. We see a consistent theme here. The reset population was around the mid-1800s. When did these orphan trains started to happen? The 1850s. When did the orphan colored asylum in New York happen, where these Irish people, which I say is black, burnt that mother to the ground? Well, they started that in 1836. Again, this was a resetting of a population. Okay? So they started this education system up north and started moving it to the south. Okay, so this particular school was in Sharpsburg, Maryland, in a small church known as Tolson's. Okay, Tolson's Chapel was at the center of local blacks' effort to educate themselves and their children. Now let's go into the African American home Methodists. It's always through the church. Not in one example of these schools have we not seen the church involved. like we saw the church involved with the orphanages, just like we saw the church involved with those insane asylums for the adults. So they're saying Tulsa Chapel in 1866 was built just 2 years after the end of slavery in Maryland, which was 1864. Okay. So Tulsa's Chapel illustrate how African Americans across the former slave-holding states created and sustained schools during the Reconstruction. So I'm not going to go through the rest of this. You can certainly go through it. It was it's going to be the same little theme. I'm not going to run through this for the sake of time, but I'll leave a link in the description if you want more detail on Tulsa's Chapel. But what I want you all to clearly get out of this whole origin of the schools is that the education of these freed blacks started in the North by church organizations and moved to the South. Right? So that's yet another example. So this is the Zion School for Colored Children in Charleston, South Carolina. During slavery, planters had tried to keep African Americans from learning to read and write. Same story. After emancipation, freed people displayed a tremendous desire to learn. Some wanted to read the Bible. Others wanted skills to read land titles. Why would slave need skills to read land titles? If you a slave, you don't have no property or no land, right? So why would you want skills to read land titles? But nonetheless, figure out wages and advance themselves in the new world of freedom. In 1866, Harper's Weekly engraving educational leader who returned to the South after the Civil War was the director of the American, there we go, never miss, the American Missionary Association, never miss, Zion School in Charleston, South Carolina, with more than 1,000 pupils. That is entirely under the superintendence of who? Colored teachers. So that's it on that. Okay. So we talked about this before on this Indian border school. I'll drop in this particular video, that particular podcast that I did behind that. Okay. So now this particular one that I'm talking about, it's going to be geared towards the Native Americans, not the indigenous population. You know, those melanated black folk that were reclassified as African Americans. This is towards the Native Americans whose origins were with India. American Indian Border Schools. This article is about the system of the United States in the United States for the residential school system in Canada, for the residential school system in Australia, for the residential school system in New Zealand, see Native schools, and for other use, see Indian school. All right. So I'm just going to read just a portion of this, because what I am telling you is that when we talk about schooling and programming, we're talking this was a worldwide system. American Indian Boarding School, also known recently as American Indian Residential Schools, were established in the United States from the 17th to the earlier 20th century with a primary objective of civilizing or assimilating Native American children and the youth into Euro-American culture. In the process, these schools didn't integrated, or I'm going to say program, Native American culture and made children give up their languages and religion. At the same time, the school provided a basic Western education. These boarding schools were first established by who? Never misses Christian missionaries of various denomination. The missionaries were often approved by the federal government to start both missions and schools on reservations, especially in lightly populated areas of the West. Yeah, that makes sense. Because that population from the West today that sits on those quote, quote, reservations that call themselves Native Americans, yeah, they put them in a school too. And their programming was to tell them they are the indigenous people of the land. Okay? In the late 19th and early 20th century, especially, the government paid religious orders to provide basic education to Native American children on reservations and later established its own schools on reservations. Okay, so I want us to be clear on the population that we are speaking on. This is specifically referring to those that are calling themselves Native Americans today. This was their programming because they were the reset population for the indigenous original people of the Americas. And as you can see, like I told y'all, this was a worldwide system because you see they have a Canadian Indian residential school system, and they have it in Australia, New Zealand, the Bureau of Indian Affairs also founded additional off-reservation boarding schools based on the assimilation model. These sometimes drew children from various tribes. In addition, religious orders established off-reservation schools. So let's be clear. These other folks, these off-reservations, could have easily and very well been the indigenous people, the indigenous, quote, quote, Indians. I don't care what you want to call them. Them black and brown. Yeah, those people. So they split them up into two categories. The reservation Indians, which will become known as the Native American Indians, which now the narrative is they're the only Indians left in the Americas. To these other folks that are in off reservations. So again, this was a worldwide system. And in the Americas, you had the Indian schools with the split category of the Indians on the reservation, the Indians not on the reservation, the freedmen the freedmen Black European children, and then the group of them both, the African American schools, consisting of indigenous Indian children and Black European children. Children were typically immersed in European American culture, schools force removal of indigenous cultural signifiers. So those of you that talk out of both sides of your mouth, you want to act like you don't understand why people don't quote, quote, know their indigenous culture when there was an entire worldwide programming going on. Don't play with me and miss me with the bull. And as you sit up and think you know your true culture when you're taking it from the Native Americans, really? Schools force removal of indigenous culture signifiers, cutting the children's hair, having them wear American-style uniforms, forbidding them from speaking their indigenous languages, and replacing their tribal names with English names, saint names under some religious order for use at the schools as part of their assimilation and Christianizing them. Now, I done already spoke on, in my particular family, we have two names. One we call a nickname, and then one we call a government name, which back in the day, they literally called that your Christian name. But that nickname was your Indian name, and we still carry that culture to this day. No child is born into our family lineage without getting an Indian name. We just don't call it an Indian name. We call it a nickname. So those of you that are running around here acting like you don't know why people don't have indigenous languages, they don't know indigenous languages, and you're trying to run around here and tell us what our indigenous culture is, I dare you. Based on what? Based on Native American culture? You mean them same Native Americans who were in the schools of the Bureau of Indian Affairs? So if they keep telling you over and over again that they were replacing their tribal names with English names and Christianized names and Christianizing them, but the Native Americans today don't have that, then who was the Indian? The schools were usually harsh, especially for younger children who had been forcibly separated from their families and forced to abandon their Native American identities and culture. Children also sometimes perished in the school system due to infectious disease. Investigations of the later 20th century have revealed many documented cases of abuse. Okay, abuse of all kind. I'm trying to get around the censoring. Occurring mostly in church-run schools. Summarizing a recent scholarship from Native Perspective, Dr. Julie Davis said, boarding schools embodied both victimization and agency for Native people, and they served as sites for both cultural loss and cultural persistence. So those of you that want to flap your gums and talk out of both sides of your mouth as you contradict yourself, you want to run that up past me again? Why cultural languages are missing? So you're trying to tell me you don't have enough comprehension to understand why one group has their quote, quote, according to them, their heritage in their in place as far as language and dress. And as it was pointed out, shout out to legendary Top Cat said, you look at them Native Americans dress across the country, it looked the same. But they were supposed to be different tribes from around the country. Why they all dressed the same? So who are these people that they keep saying lost their culture? But one group has their culture. So you can miss me with the bull. You better check yourself while you got your nose in the air. Because there's clearly two distinguishing groups. These institutions intended to assimilate Native people into mainstream society and eradicate Native cultures. Became an integral component of American Indian identities and eventually fueled the drive for political and cultural self-determination in the late 20th century. So you all can read the rest of this. I'm not going to go into it. It is what it is from this point. Okay. So I'm bringing this point up to once again put the Indian schools into the mix to show you that this was also the creating of the Native American population and the splitting off of the indigenous Indian population. This was also part of a programming of the children, the resetting of the population. So let's just recap. We're going to summarize. So you have, sorry, I hope I'm not making you dizzy. You have colored orphans in the 1830s out of New York. And they school got burnt to the ground. And not school, this orphan asylum got burnt to the ground by some Irish folk. And I'm saying they were black Irish folk. And in these orphanage, they wind up being trained for farming and the work. Then in the same time period, about the 1850-ish, you got the Caucasian orphan trains out of New York. Okay, and I'm telling you, they came from Europe. That were being what? Trained to be some type of skill or trade, and they were shipped out to the Midwest. Okay? So we have the history of orphanages coming up out of Europe. And they created a worldwide system, but it spanned across not only Great Britain, but Spain, Italy, India, and British Guyana. Then you had the school of the Freemans that was ran by blacks. coming out of the north that expanded. They took that model to the south. Okay? We're still talking children. Okay? And then in the South, specifically Charleston, South Carolina, which was also a huge port. Okay? Because usually you look at the records in Charleston, you see folks coming from what we're calling today the Caribbeans, coming from the North. And even we have to take it to the account coming from South America. Charleston was a huge port. A lot of them Huguenots in Charleston. The melanated black Huguenots. Shout out to Cuimeo. So out of Charleston, South Carolina, you have a school for colored children that was ran by colored teachers. Okay. And then finally, because, let no child be left behind. Okay? Let no child be left behind in this reset of the population. So now you have this Indian, what they're calling the Native Americans, which are the Asians. Their origins are Asian. And then them other Indians that didn't go on their reservation. Where are them other Indians that didn't go on their reservation? Because today, y'all saying all of the Indians are this Native American population. Primarily the large basis of them on the reservation. Where did them other Indians go that were educated as well? And their goal was to assimilate them. The goal was to assimilate them, eradicate their cultures, gave them Christianized names. What happened to those that other Indian population that didn't go on them reservations? Because even if we look at this picture, let me blow this up. Those don't look like the Indians. And it's the 1900s. This picture was taken in the 1900s. But prior to this, that's not the picture of the Indians as far as their phenotype that we see. These look like what are called now Hispanic people, so a mixture of Mexican folk and Asian. And note that this is from the 1900s. So these are the Native Americans. But what happened to the mother folk? What happened to the mother Indians? So again, folks, I hope you got something out of this. Sorry it was so long. The entire world has been duped. There has been many resets, I believe, on this planet. And the most recent one was the one right around 1700s. And they finalized the reset during the 1900s. They shifted the population around and they switched identities. Okay. Now you can take it for what it's worth. That's my theory, just backed up by these facts that they gonna call coincidences. Okay, whatever you want to call them. But the official story that they have now told and are telling, it's not truthful. Okay? So I hope you got some value out of this information. If you are not subscribed to us, I highly encourage you to subscribe, like, and share. And I wish everyone well on this Tuesday. This is Rhonda with WTUZ Radio Podcast. Peace and love, family.